The night air split open with a scream, so sharp it made my heart stop cold. I spun toward the porch just in time to see Karen, the neighbor who had spent months picking fights over petty HOA rules, charging across my yard, a gleam of steel catching the porch light. In her fist was a long kitchen knife, its edge flashing as she lunged straight for my pregnant wife, who stood frozen with our disabled son clinging to her side. Time seemed to slow as pure instinct roared through me. I vaulted the steps, shouting for her to drop the weapon, but her face twisted with fury, eyes wild and unrecognizable. The world narrowed to the sound of my son's terrified sobs and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I could smell the metallic tang of fear in the air, the raw scent of danger, so close it burned my throat. Every muscle in my body locked onto a single truth. One wrong move, and I could lose everything: my wife, my child, our future. What Karen didn't know as she raised that knife higher was that I wasn't just any neighbor she could intimidate. Beneath the calm life I'd built lay years of legal training in federal authority, and in that instant, the full weight of my position as a federal judge surged forward like a hidden storm. She had no idea she was about to cross a line that would change her life forever, and I was ready to make sure she never threatened my family again. The days leading up to that terrifying night had been deceptively peaceful, almost serene, like the calm surface of a lake before a violent storm. Our home sat on a quiet, tree-lined street where sunlight filtered gently through towering oaks and the distant hum of lawnmowers marked the slow rhythm of suburban life. My wife, radiant in her third trimester, filled our house with warmth and laughter as she prepared a nursery filled with soft blankets and tiny clothes, while our disabled son's joyful giggles echoed through the hallways as he wheeled himself from room to room, eager to help in his own way. We spent late afternoons in the garden, planting flowers and sharing stories about the baby we couldn't wait to meet, while neighbors waved politely as they walked their dogs or pushed strollers past our gate. From the outside, it was the very picture of an American dream: love, security, and the quiet anticipation of new life. I balanced my demanding career as a federal judge with evenings of home-cooked meals and bedtime stories, finding solace in the simple rituals that bound us together. Yet, beneath that tranquil surface, faint cracks had begun to show. Small, unsettling moments. A fleeting shadow of hostility in Karen's gaze when she passed our yard, the sharp notes in her voice when she complained about her son's wheelchair ramp, flickered at the edges of our happiness like distant lightning. I brushed them off as neighborhood quirks, never suspecting that these subtle sparks of malice were the first whispers of a nightmare that would soon erupt into violence. It began with whispers and petty notes, the kind of small cruelties most neighbors dismiss as simple misunderstandings. At first, Karen's discontent showed up as passive-aggressive remarks about our son's wheelchair ramp lowering property values or complaints about the cheerful garden lights we'd strung along the porch. She would linger on the sidewalk with arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning our yard as if cataloging violations for some invisible rulebook. One morning we found an unsigned letter taped to our door claiming our ramp violated HOA aesthetic standards, though it had been approved months earlier. Another day, she called the HOA president to insist that our son's therapy sessions in the backyard were too noisy, though they were nothing more than laughter and soft music. Each act felt small on its own, but together they built a slow, tightening pressure around our home. When I calmly explained the legality of our accommodations, her smile stretched tight, her eyes cold, and she muttered that people like you think you're above the rules. My wife tried to reason with her, offering cookies and conversation, but Karen's hostility only sharpened. Soon she was reporting us for imaginary infractions, trash cans supposedly left out too long, lawn edges a fraction too high, and showing up at neighborhood meetings with exaggerated stories about us ignoring community standards. We stayed patient, believing reason and kindness would win. But behind that polite facade, her resentment festered, gathering like storm clouds. What we didn't yet realize was that these first sparks of hostility were not merely neighborhood squabbles, they were the earliest tremors of the violent eruption that would soon shatter our lives. The night of the attack descended under a sky that seemed unnaturally still, the kind of eerie quiet that presses on the ears and hints that something terrible is waiting to break loose. And as the last porch light flickered across the cul-de-sac, I felt an unease that I couldn't name, a subtle tightening in my chest that made me double-check every lock and window before I kissed my pregnant wife goodnight and tucked her son in with his favorite story. Yet, even as I tried to sleep, the wind carried faint, strange sounds that didn't belong to an ordinary evening, soft crunches of gravel near the side gate, the muffled creak of wood that seemed to travel through the house like a whisper of warning. Until at a little past midnight, the silence snapped with a metallic clang that jolted me upright like an electric current, and in that instant the world went from peaceful to perilous. I moved fast, adrenaline sharpening my senses until every heartbeat was a thunderclap, the federal judge in me already calculating threat and response. And as I reached the hallway, I heard the unmistakable scrape of a door hinge from the back porch, followed by the low, guttural murmur of a woman's voice, Karen's voice, cutting through the night, with a venom I had never heard before. She stepped into our kitchen like a figure carved from the shadows, the porch light catching the cold gleam of a knife in her hand, her eyes glittering with a reckless fury that made the air itself feel heavy. My wife's startled gasp from the bedroom tightened my focus to a razor's edge. I motioned for her to stay put as I quietly positioned myself between the hallway and the intruder, but Karen moved with an unhinged determination, calling out accusations that spilled like acid. Claims that we had ruined the neighborhood, that our son's wheelchair ramp was a blight she would end tonight, each word fueling the terror that gripped the house. The smell of cold steel and damp earth filled my nose as I commanded her to stop, my voice firm and measured despite the racing of my heart, but she only tightened her grip, the knife flashing in the dim light as she advanced, and for a split second every sound magnified. The ticking clock in the foyer, my son whimpering from his room, the faint hum of the refrigerator, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Training and instinct fused in that critical moment. I drew on years of federal courtroom composure and the quiet decisiveness honed from handling volatile situations, using a calm but forceful tone to warn her of the consequences she was walking into, reminding her that every second of her trespass and threat was being recorded on the security cameras already pinging live to local police. My words only seemed to feed the storm raging inside her, and she lurched forward, slamming a chair aside with a crack that echoed like gunfire through the house. But I anticipated her move, stepping in with the authority and command of someone who has spent a lifetime enforcing the law, forcing her back with a clarity of action that left no room for error. Behind me, my wife had quietly called 911 and was relaying every detail to dispatch, her voice steady despite the tremor of fear, and soon the distant wail of sirens began to thread through the night air. Faint but growing, a lifeline of sound that told me help was closing in. Karen heard it too. A flicker of doubt crossed her wild eyes as the blue-red strobe of approaching patrol cars began to paint the walls, but she hesitated only a heartbeat before the rage reclaimed her, and she shouted incoherently about taking back the neighborhood as she swung the knife with a desperation that smelled of pure chaos. I deflected her lunge with the precision of someone who has faced high-stakes confrontations in court and life, guiding her momentum away from my family, and using the solid edge of the kitchen island as a barrier, every motion deliberate, controlled, designed to protect without escalating into irreversible harm. Outside, tires screeched against asphalt and heavy boots pounded toward our door. A command barked through a bullhorn. Drop the weapon, hands where we can see them. Cut through the tension like lightning, and for the first time Karen's defiance wavered as floodlights poured through the windows, turning night into blinding day. In a blur of shouts and coordinated movement, officers surged in, their training as precise as the federal protocols I'd built my career on, surrounding her with shields of authority until the knife clattered to the floor and the danger that had gripped our home like a vice finally cracked. The air itself seemed to exhale as she was restrained and read her rights, the rage that had fueled her breaking into a hollow disbelief when she realized whose house she had invaded and whose family she had threatened, a federal judge with every legal and evidentiary safeguard already in place. Even as the officers led her away, still muttering about rules and revenge, I stood in the center of our kitchen holding my wife and son close, feeling the weight of what almost happened settle into my bones, the metallic tang of fear slowly replaced by the steady warmth of survival and justice. Outside, neighbors had gathered in hushed clusters, their faces pale in the flashing lights, while inside, I looked at the shattered remnants of our once peaceful night. The overturned chair, the scattered phone, the faint outline of a knife on the tile, and knew that everything had changed in those relentless minutes. Yet, beneath the shock and exhaustion, a deeper resolve burned. Karen's attack had not just been a crime of violence, it had been a challenge to the safety and dignity of every family who chooses compassion over cruelty, and I would ensure that the full force of the law answered it. As the last siren faded and the first pale streaks of dawn began to touch the horizon, I held my loved ones tighter, vowing silently that this would be the night, not only of terror but of reckoning, a night when malice met unshakable justice and lost. Morning came with a gray, heavy sky that seemed to carry the weight of everything we had endured, and as the flashing police lights faded from the street, an unsettling quiet settled over our home, the kind of silence that feels louder than chaos. The kitchen still bore the scars of the night. The overturned chair, the faint scuff marks on the tile where the knife had fallen, and every glance around the room sent a fresh wave of disbelief through me. My pregnant wife clung to my arm, her face pale, but composed, while our disabled son refused to leave her side, his wide eyes reflecting the confusion and fear he couldn't fully put into words. Yet, instead of relief, the morning brought a new kind of turmoil. At the station, where we went to give formal statements, I watched in frustration as the process that should have been swift and decisive began to slow under layers of red tape and small-town politics. Despite the security footage and the multiple witnesses, I overheard an officer murmuring about mental instability and possible self-defense, words that twisted the clear-cut facts into something murky and dangerous. Karen, astonishingly calm when questioned, claimed she was protecting the neighborhood, and that we had provoked her with our so-called defiance of HOA standards, a story so absurd it might have been laughable if it weren't threatening to erode the truth. To my dismay, a few HOA board members echoed her language, hinting that our wheelchair ramp and late-night backyard therapy sessions had created tensions, as though my son's right to accessibility and our family's quiet life were open to debate. Every time I asserted the legal reality, our permits, our constitutional rights, the multiple restraining order violations already documented, I felt the subtle pushback of bureaucracy. The careful words, the requests to stay patient while we investigate, the sideways glances that suggested my authority as a federal judge made some officials uneasy rather than decisive. It was an infuriating inversion of justice. The very system I had served and trusted seemed to falter when my own family needed it most. Back at home, neighbors who had once waved warmly now avoided eye contact, some whispering across lawns while pretending to water plants, as if Karen's delusions had planted seeds of suspicion. News vans parked discreetly at the corner, their cameras hungry for a headline, while online community forums buzzed with speculation that blurred fact and rumor. Each evening we double-checked the locks, comforted our son through nightmares, and tried to reclaim a sense of safety that felt just out of reach. Through it all, a low, steady determination hardened inside me. I spent late nights reviewing every detail of the case, compiling evidence, cross-referencing statutes, and preparing motions to ensure no loophole could give Karen a way back into our lives. Yet, beneath the lawyerly precision, a deeper anger smoldered, not just at Karen, but at a system that could allow a violent intruder to spin the narrative while a family who had done everything right was left to prove its innocence again and again. This was no longer only about one night's terror. It had become a test of whether justice could truly protect the vulnerable when prejudice and pettiness threatened to warp it. And as I looked at my wife's determined face and my son's quiet resilience, I knew that waiting passively was not an option. Something inside me shifted from defense to resolve. The fight was no longer about surviving an attack, but about exposing every weakness in the machinery that had nearly failed us. ensuring that the reckoning Karen had delayed with lies and technicalities would come swift and undeniable. The day after Karen's arrest, as the shock gave way to clarity, I sat at my home office desk with a legal pad and a fierce sense of purpose, the kind of sharp determination that had driven me through years of federal court battles. This was no longer just about keeping my family safe, it was about dismantling every escape route Karen might try to use. The first step was evidence, and I approached it like constructing an ironclad case file, downloading every minute of security footage, printing the threatening letters she had left on our door, and cataloging the HOA's prior approvals for our wheelchair ramp and every home modification. I contacted neighbors who had heard her shouting or seen her pacing our property in the weeks before the attack, carefully drafting affidavits so their statements would stand in any courtroom. My wife, still shaken but resolute, reached out to the emergency dispatcher and officers from that night, securing body cam footage and the 911 call transcript, every word reinforcing the danger we faced. At the same time, I began the quiet but crucial work of outmaneuvering any attempt by Karen's supporters to spin the narrative. I scheduled meetings with the district attorney and the lead detective, presenting not just evidence, but a timeline that exposed her escalation from harassment to violence. I also filed for an immediate and permanent restraining order, ensuring that even if she posted bail, she would never come within 1,000 feet of our home. To guard against HOA interference, I sent formal notices citing federal disability access law and the Fair Housing Act, warning that any board member who backed Karen's complaints would face civil liability. Behind the scenes, I coordinated with a trusted colleague at the federal courthouse to monitor any motion for leniency or psychiatric diversion, knowing the courthouse was charged with a quiet electricity the morning Karen finally faced the consequences she had tried so desperately to outrun. Reporters lined the steps like a gauntlet of cameras and microphones, their lenses glinting beneath the gray sky, but I walked past them with a steady calm born of weeks of meticulous preparation. Inside, the air buzzed with a tense expectancy as neighbors filled the gallery, some curious, some still in disbelief that the woman they'd known from block parties and board meetings could have carried a knife into our home. When Karen entered, escorted by deputies, the brittle arrogance she once wore like armor had cracked into something smaller and meaner. Her eyes darted across the room, searching for sympathy and finding none. The prosecution opened with a devastating clarity, projecting the security footage onto the courtroom screens. The sound of the door creaking open, the cold gleam of the blade in her hand, the sharp, threatening words that left no doubt about intent. Witnesses followed. Neighbors who testified about her escalating harassment, officers who described her refusal to comply, and the 911 dispatcher who recounted the terror in my wife's voice that night. Each account reinforced a single inescapable truth. This was not a momentary lapse, but a deliberate, dangerous act. Karen's attorney tried to shift blame to stress and neighborhood tensions, but the weight of the evidence crushed every attempt at deflection. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my statement measured yet unflinching, describing the fear in my child's eyes and the resolve it took to stay calm under threat, ending with a simple declaration that no family should live in fear inside their own home. By the time closing arguments ended, the courtroom felt carved from silence, the jury's deliberation almost perfunctory. Their verdict, guilty on all counts, including aggravated assault and unlawful entry, landed like the final stone in a carefully built foundation. The judge, noting her lack of remorse and the premeditation evident in her actions, handed down a sentence that guaranteed years of confinement and mandated mental health treatment, ensuring she would never again menace our family or any other. As deputies led her away, Karen's last glance was not of defiance, but of stunned realization, the look of someone who finally understood that her campaign of fear had only built her own prison. Outside, the once whispering neighbors now approached with words of support and apology, some even pledging to help repair the damage she had tried to inflict. The weight that had pressed on her home for months lifted like a storm breaking, replaced by a calm strengthened by justice. Karen's downfall wasn't just a legal victory. It was a resounding affirmation that hatred and intimidation could never triumph over preparation community, and the steady force of the law. G. Karen's attorney might attempt to paint her as unstable rather than dangerous. Each action felt like laying a brick in a fortress, a structure of truth and law that no excuse could penetrate. Yet I didn't rely solely on legal channels. Quietly, I updated our home security system with reinforced locks, a panic alarm connected directly to local police, and motion-activated lighting bright enough to turn night into day. I hired a reputable security consultant to audit the property, installing hidden cameras that even the HOA couldn't protest. Every evening, I briefed my wife and son with calm precision, turning fear into a clear safety plan so they felt empowered instead of cornered. The more I worked, the more the balance of power shifted. What began as a desperate attempt to protect my family evolved into a carefully orchestrated trap, a comprehensive, unassailable case that left Karen with nowhere to run. As court dates approached, I kept a deliberate public silence, letting the weight of irrefutable evidence build behind the scenes like a rising tide. By the end of that week, every possible loophole had been sealed, every reckless claim neutralized. Karen believed she could storm into our lives and hide behind neighborhood gossip and legal technicalities. Instead, she had walked directly into a cage of her own making, one I had constructed with patience, precision, and an unshakable resolve to see justice not only done but seen to be done. In the weeks after Karen's conviction, our home slowly transformed from a place of anxiety back into the haven it was meant to be. The wheelchair ramp she had once targeted became a symbol of triumph. Decorated with cheerful pots of bright flowers, our neighbors brought over as quiet offerings of solidarity. The same community that once whispered in hesitation now visited with open hearts, offering meals, repairs, and, most importantly, genuine friendship. My pregnant wife finally slept through the night without startling at every creak of wood, her laughter returning like sunlight breaking through clouds. Our son regained his joy and confidence, proudly showing friends the new security system and calling it his super shield, proof that he felt safe again. As for me, I felt a deeper calm settle in my chest, knowing the long months of evidence gathering, legal motions, and court appearances had not only protected my family, but also set a precedent in our community. Accessibility and safety are rights that cannot be bullied or ignored. The story, however, didn't stay contained to our street. Local news segments about the case went national, sparking conversations about HOA accountability and the importance of protecting families with disabilities. My quiet federal career had never drawn such attention, but interviews and think pieces praised the decisive, yet measured way we had turned terror into justice. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, my wife gently placed my hand on her growing belly and smiled, whispering that our child would be born into a world where neighbors now looked out for each other instead of turning a blind eye. In that moment, I realized this ordeal had left us stronger, not shattered. Justice had spoken, community had rallied, and love, fierce, patient, unbreakable, had won. If you followed our story to the end, let it be a reminder. Stand up for your family, guard your peace, and never underestimate the quiet power of preparation. Subscribe to our channel and share this story, because the more we shine light on the truth, the less room darkness has to hide.